Alright guys, welcome to the Exam 5 review. Thank you for attending. This is being recorded. I've kind of made them into a PowerPoint this time instead of the Word document so that you can see it better when you go back and watch the recording. So let's begin. So we start off with the nervous tissue. So what is the overall function of the nervous system? It's to receive, integrate, and process sensory information with a motor output response to the sensory information. So you receive a signal from the environment, the signal gets sent to your brain integrates it, processes it, and then it elicits a motor response to the effector organ. So the central nervous system is split into two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. Very simple. Anything outside of that is the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is split up into a sensory division and a motor division. And the sensory division part of it, you have visceral sensory, which is your organs, your visceral organs, and then you have your somatic sensory division, which is your skin, joints, and your muscle. And then you also have the visceral motor and then the somatic motor. So these are the sensory aspects of it. So they receive the sensory information, whether it's pain, temperature, whatever it is. And then the motor, it sends the appropriate response to either the organ, if it's a visceral motor, or the skin, joint, or skeletal muscle, if you're a somatic motor division. Now, the visceral motor is split into the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic. Okay? Now, the sympathetic is your fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic division is your rest and digest. Okay, so that's why after you eat, you feel a little tired. That is your parasympathetic system kicking in. On the other side of that, if you fight with your boss, girlfriend, whatever it is, your fight or flight kicks in, okay? Because your body thinks you're in a stressful environment and it elicits the appropriate response. Please chime in whenever you guys want. You guys can turn on your microphones to talk to me or ask questions as I'm talking, okay? So it's asking here, what are the components and function of the central nervous system? So the CNS is to process sensory information and make an appropriate motor response. Again, is the brain and spinal cord. And it's asking for the components of the peripheral nervous system. So it's anything that's not the brain and spinal cord. Okay, and it receives sensory information and it sends it to the central nervous system. And it also carries out the motor response from the CNS with these motor neurons. Then we have the somatic system. So what is the somatic nervous system? What is the autonomic nervous system? And what is the difference between them? So the somatic nervous system is the one that we can control. Okay? So skeletal muscles, that's the somatic. The autonomic is the ones that we cannot control. And this is part of the nervous system. And this is the autonomic, the one that we can't control, is the one that splits into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Okay, here, what are the layers of the neuron? So if we're going from outside, the outermost layer to the innermost layer. Okay, so you start off with the epineurium, covering the entire nerve. Then you have inside of it, you have little fascicles. That connective tissue is called the perineurium, surrounding the fascicles. And then inside the muscle fascicle, you have individual nerve fibers. That's called the endoneurium. So similar to the muscle, where is the epimysium, perimysium, endomysium, this is the similar. It's epineurium, perineurium, then endoneurium. What is myelination and how does it affect the speed of conduction? So myelination acts as an insulator for the axons, increasing the speed of the conduction. Okay, so acts as an insulator and it increases the speed. Okay, because there are other nerve bundle fibers surround in the area. So if it's not insulated, the electrical signal might jump from one nerve fiber to another nerve fiber, and you do not want that. Okay, so it keeps the signal on the same track and it keeps the signal moving pretty fast. So the glial cells that do this are called the oligodendrocytes in the CNS. So the oligodendrocytes produce myelin in the central nervous system. Now the Schwann cells produce myelin in the peripheral nervous system. So these both produce myelin, but one is in the CNS, one is in the peripheral. Next question is, what is non-myelination and how does it affect the speed of conduction? It's basically when the axon is not myelinated, so it either has no oligodendrocyte, no Schwann cell around it, so it's not insulated. So there's no white lipid coating. And this usually means that the speed of conduction is slowed. So this is the nerve right here. On the outermost layer, the outermost is the epineurium. Then you have the nerve fascicles. Each nerve fascicle is surrounded by the perineurium. And then inside the nerve fascicle, you have the nerve fibers, and each individual nerve fiber is surrounded by the endoneurium. Okay, so this is asking what is resistance, and this relates to Ohm's law. And all it means is that the voltage is directly proportional to I, which is current, and R, resistance. So what does this mean? It just means that if current goes up, voltage goes up. If resistance goes up, voltage goes up. If on the opposite side of that, if current goes down, voltage goes down. If resistance goes down, voltage goes down. Just know that relationship, okay? They're just directly proportional. There are two types of conduction. What are they? We have saltatory conduction, we have continuous conduction. For saltatory conduction, that refers to the jumping of the signals from node to node. So this happens in myelinated axons. Okay, saltatory happens in myelinated axons. And then in continuous, so there are no myelin sheaths. So the signal just literally just goes down the line. And this is a I don't want to say very slow process, but it's slower than the saltatory. And this occurs on non-myelinated axons. There are a couple of non-myelinated axons, and they're located in this the central nervous system. Any questions so far? All right, good. Now, there are different types of neurons. There is a unipolar. Okay, you have axonic, bipolar, unipolar, and multipolar. All right, thanks, Carlos. So the unipolar, it just has one axon from the cell body. Okay. Well, technically unipolar are pseudo-unipolar. They look like they're one pole, but not really. But for the sake of the exam, unipolar, it has one axon from the cell body. Okay. Bipolar, it has two processes from the cell body. So one right here and one right here. Multipolar, it has multiple processes coming from the cell body. This right here, and then these right there. All of that. Now, multipolar, know that this is the most abundant one in our body. Okay, please remember that. The multipolar neuron is the most abundant one. Now, the anaxonic neuron is not so common. It literally just has no axon. It's just there to receive sensory information. Okay, so a couple questions on the left. What is a sensory neuron? What is an interneuron? And what are Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes? So for the Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, I want you guys to answer that. Okay, so once we finish with that, I'm going to ask you what these are, what they produce, and where. So please get ready to provide an answer. I want some participation. So a sensory neuron is simple. We call those afferent neurons. So whenever you hear afferent neuron, that is sensory. It's taking information from the peripheral. So you're anywhere that's not your brain and spinal cord, and it takes that information to the brain and spinal cord. So there is no question about a motor neuron, but let's just answer it. So a motor neuron is an efferent neuron. So whenever you hear efferent, know that's referring to the motor neuron. So something that makes your body move, okay? Or it changes the muscle or the gland to elicit a response. Whenever you hear afferent, again, that's sensory. Those two are interchangeable, so don't get confused if you see those terms. And the motor neuron is literally the neuron that goes out and sends the signal to the effector. So an effector, I'm not sure if it's one of the questions later on, but I'll go over it right now. It is what elicits the response in the nervous system. So this can be a muscle or a gland. So let's say a fly lands on your hand. You receive that sensory information, your afferent neurons takes that information to your brain, okay? Your brain is like, okay, thanks for the information, hand, move. The motor neuron goes down, sends the signal to your hand, and you quickly move your hand. So that muscle, your hand muscle, is the effector, right? Because it elicits the response. Your brain wants to take the fly out, so it moves the hand out of the way. Next, an interneuron. An interneuron is in between sensory and motor neurons. These are usually located in the spinal cord. Okay, and they process and integrate information. So there's not just one neuron. So that's not sensory neuron, brain, then motor neuron. No, it's sensory, interneuron. It processes the information. It sends it to the brain if it has to. The brain processes it. It sends it back down. Some more interneurons are at play here just to organize the signal. And then finally it exits through the motor neuron. Okay? So Schwann cells, we already talked about it. What do these two cells produce? Is the white coat surrounding the axon? What is that called? It's called yeah, perfect, Tiffany. Thank you. It's the myelin sheath. Now the Schwann cell produces myelin sheath for what nervous system? The central or the peripheral? Perfect. Schwann cell is PNS. Oligodendrocyte is CNS. Okay. Now something important to note, the oligodendrocyte in the CNS myelinates multiple axons. Okay. Now the Schwann cell myelinates one axon, not even an axon, just part of an axon. So one axon has hundreds of Schwann cells. Okay. But is localized to just one axon or one part of an axon. While the oligodendrocyte um, myelinates multiple axons of different neurons. Okay, so what are the structures that protect the brain and spinal cord? The skull protects the brain, spinal column, the vertebral column, however you want to call it, protects the spinal cord. And then you have on the spinal cord terminal ligaments to hold it in place. What are the meninges is the next question. It's a connective tissue layer surrounding the spinal cord. We're going to get into that in a little bit. And next question is, what is the function of the cerebral spinal fluid? Do you guys know what neuroglial cell produces the cerebral spinal fluid? The ependymal cells. So these cells line the ventricle of the brain and spinal cord, or the cavities in the brain and spinal cord. That's what a ventricle is, little hollow areas. They line the ventricles and they produce the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, what does the cerebral spinal fluid do? It cushions the brain and the spinal cord. It decreases friction and it provides nutrients. Okay, and produced by the ependymal cells. And these are in the central nervous system, right? Because we're talking about the brain and spinal cord here. So here is a picture of a vertebra, and here we are talking about the meninges right here. The innermost layer is the pia mater, then outside of that is the arachnoid mater, and then outside of that is the dura mater, okay? And then in between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater, you have the subarachnoid space. And then above the dura mater, you have the subdural space. Okay, and then above that, where there's fat, the epidural space. So again, this is where epidural procedure occurs right here, when they stick the needle in the spine, it's in the epidural space. Oh, I kind of skipped ahead. Okay, so what produces CSF is the ependymal cells like we discussed, and they line the ventricles of the brain and spine and the innermost epithelium of the spinal cord. What else? So what is the most abundant glial cells of the CNS and what is its function? So the most abundant one is the astrocytes. Okay, and these astrocytes They produce the blood-brain barrier. What does that mean? So your brain has a bunch of capillaries, right? These astrocytes are literally sitting on top of the capillaries, and they're also attached to the neurons. Did you guys say something? Okay, never mind. So these astrocytes are on the capillaries. Literally, nothing goes to the brain without going through the astrocytes. Okay, this is why it's a blood-brain barrier, because it selects what can go through. Okay, very selective. It doesn't let anything just go through to the brain. Okay, this is the bodyguard, so to speak. Other glial cells, or when we talk about glial cells, we talk about these supporting cells. So we already talked about two of them in the central nervous system. First is the ependymal cell. Then we have the astrocyte, another glial cell in the CNS. Since we're talking about that, let's continue with it. You have our, what is the other one? Oligodendrocyte that produces the myelin. Okay, then you have these macrophages. These are just a couple of them, okay? But the most important ones are the ependymal cells, astrocytes, and these oligodendrocytes, okay? Now, they're the glial cells in the PNS, pretty simple. Just two. One of them is the Schwann cell that produces the myelin, and then the others are satellite cells. And these just perform various functions, okay? You don't really need to know the specifics of these, except for the Schwann cell, of course, which produces myelin. But these are the two glial cells, or the supporting cells of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, there's a cortex part. Let's not worry about it. Is these. So what is the difference between columns, tracts, horns? The cortex, again, we're not going to worry about that. So columns are either ascending or descending. If you're ascending, it's sensory. If you're descending, it's motor. If you guys want to think about it, it makes sense, right? Because if the sensory information needs to go to your brain, where is your brain located? It's up, right? So it needs to ascend to the brain. Now, when the brain makes a response, it decides what it wants to do. It sends out the motor response. Everything else is below the brain, so it needs to descend down the spinal column. Okay? Tracts are axons found in the central nervous system. Okay? So again, these tracts are inside these columns. Columns are just basically axons. Okay? Either you're ascending, you have sensory tracts that ascend in these columns, and then you have motor tracts or motor axons descending down this column. So horns are the cell bodies and the unmyelinated axons. And that's where the horns are found. And this is a gray color. I believe I do have a picture which will better show you guys. And then the tracts and columns, these are white. They appear white under the microscope. Okay, and they're white because they have the myelinated axons. They're just axons. Next are, what are the enlargements of the spinal cord and why do they form? There are two enlargements, your cervical and your lumbar. They form because that's where our limbs are, okay? They're just some extra nerves and stuff that just need to go to our legs. So that area, to our legs and hands and arms, so that area is a little bit bigger to accommodate for those extra nerves that need to go through. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about gray matter. So the gray matter consists of the soma, or the cell body, unmyelinated axons. Again, the myelinated axons are this white lipid. They appear white. So if you're unmyelinated, there is no color. Okay, it's just a gray color. And the neuroglia, the supporting cells. Gray commissure, let's not worry about that. You have two important parts of the horn. The posterior, or the dorsal. This is where the sensory information comes from, okay? The sensory information comes from the dorsal part, or the backside. Motor neurons, the motor aspect is the ventral part of the horn. Again, I'll show you guys this in a little bit. And then lateral horns, let's not worry about that. It's not really an exam question. Okay, here we go. Try to zoom in a little bit, maybe just once, so you can see it a little bit better. So the gray matter is this part right here. These are what we call the horns, okay? Because they kind of do look like horns. So this area is just cell bodies of the neuron. Cell bodies, dendrites, unmyelinated axons. Okay, so the posterior part of it, or at least this half, or the dorsal part, is for sensory information. Whether it's sensory somatic or sensory visceral, it's still sensory information. This part of it, the front half, is motor information. I'm talking about the front half of the horns, okay? This is for motor information. Again, let's go next. Okay, we talked about this. Dorsal half, sensory roots. The ventral half is the motor roots. Okay, so if we go back, dorsal half is the backside. This is the dorsal half. And then the ventral half is that right here. So ventral half is motor. Dorsal half is sensory. Okay, some 4 zones that are pretty important are these right here. Somatic sensory, visceral sensory, visceral motor, and somatic motor. So remember how we split the horns in 2? Now each division is also split up in half to accommodate for the somatic sensory and the visceral sensory. And then the motor portion is also split up in half to accommodate for the visceral and the somatic motor. We'll talk about those right now, actually. Here we go. So this is the horn, right? So we said this half is the sensory, hence the S and the S and the end. Now the somatic sensory, so stuff that comes from our joints, skin, and skeletal muscles, they are in this blue thing right here called SS. Now sensory information from our organs come right here, the green part, visceral somatic, visceral sensory. Okay, now the visceral motor, so the actions of the organs, for example, let's say food comes in, your stomach, your body needs to release bile, whatever. So this visceral motor goes to the appropriate section of the organ and it says, hey, release bile, we need to break down food. This is where it happens right here. Now the somatic motor, the response, so if you want to move your hands, you want to dance, whatever you want to do, this is where that motor response comes from, this portion of the horn. And again, they're on either side, okay? It's not just one side. It mirrors itself. Okay, now we're talking about white matter. So when we're talking about white matter, it is the myelinated axons. Okay, don't worry about this. So we were talking about the gray matter before. I know this picture looks a lot. Don't worry, you guys are not gonna have to memorize any of this yet. That will be for next exam. This is the gray matter. Anything outside of it is the white matter. So all of this is white matter. Now they're grouped differently because, again, each axon has a different function. Each part of the spinal cord has a different function. And these are just basically axons or columns or tracts. Whenever you hear columns, tracts, know that we're talking about white matter, okay? Because tracts refer to the axons. That is what they were talking about when they say tract. That is the axon, okay? Axon in the central nervous system, because we are in the spinal cord at the moment. Okay, where are motor tracts found and what are their functions? So motor tracts, again, like we said, they are descending, and they're found in the spinal column. And they are there just to respond, to cause a response to the affected organ or muscle. Now, sensory tracts, what are they? They're just axons or afferent neurons that carry sensory information up the spinal cord. So sensory information is carried up the spinal cord, motor information is carried down the spinal cord. So what are the nerves found within the cervical plexus? So the main one in the cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. Okay, this is in between C3, C5, and this controls our diaphragm, so our breathing. So this is where control for our breathing comes from. There's a nerve that exits out of our cervical vertebrae around this area right here, and this is what controls our diaphragm. Now the brachial plexus is in the cervical plexus. It's kind of below it, but it's still on the cervical part of the body. Remember that we have a cervical enlargement. The brachial plexus goes through this. Okay, this controls our arms. So sensation, movement, whatever it is, anything you do with your arm, that is because of the brachial plexus, the nerves that come out of the cervical, the cervix. No, not the cervix, the cervical vertebrae. Next, what are the nerves found in the lumbar plexus? The main ones for the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve. Okay. Another one is the obturator. What are the nerves found in the sacral plexus? The most important one here is the sciatic nerve. Okay, that is the major one that comes out of the sacral plexus. Any questions? Okay, so for the cervical plexus, sorry, give me a sec. My computer just froze. All right, we should be good. All right, thank you, Tiffany. Now the cervical plexus, the most important one is your phrenic nerve down here. It's between C3 and C5, and this controls our breathing. So if somebody has an injury in that area, they may have a problem breathing. Okay, they might be at risk to damage the phrenic nerve. If that happens, that's just terrible. You can't breathe anymore, you'll die. Okay, don't worry about these other ones. Next are brachial plexus. Okay, it's between C4 and T1. Okay. I'm gonna point out some important parts of the brachial plexus. We have our radial nerve, our ulnar nerve, our median nerve, another radial nerve. This is a superficial branch. It's not so deep. Okay. The only thing that is not in the brachial plexus is the phrenic nerve, right? The phrenic nerve was in the cervical plexus. Next, we have our lumbar plexus. Is between L1 and L4, and the major ones are the femoral and the obturator. Okay. Here we go. This is the lumbar plexus. The obturator is right here on the side. So it innervates all the leg muscles that are on the side. So your adductor, your gracilis, anything, any muscle on the inside of your thigh is innervated by the obturator. And then the femoral nerve innervates basically the rest of the leg. Now, the sacral plexus is in between L4, S4. Okay, and just all you need to know is the major nerve is the sciatic nerve. Okay. The question types, I believe, are which of these nerves is not part of the sacral plexus, or which of these nerves is not part of the brachial plexus, for example. And you just need to know these main ones, and you guys will be fine for it, okay? Sacral plexus, again, the sciatic nerve is the major one right here. Okay, now a little mnemonic to remember which one is ventral and which one is dorsal. So afferent nerves, aka sensory nerves, run afferent. Think of Dave. This mnemonic is straight from Professor Garcia. Okay, dorsal, afferent, ventral, efferent. Okay, so all afferent neurons or sensory neurons are on the dorsal part of the spinal cord or the back side, the posterior side. Efferent neurons, they run ventrally or on the anterior or front side of the spinal cord. And what is a mixed nerve? What is a mixed nerve? A nerve with both sensory and motor information. An example of this, you guys don't need to know this, is the phrenic nerve that we talked about. Okay, it has both sensory and motor information just to kind of gauge the diaphragm, see where it's at, and elicit a motor response to get it to contract or relax, depending on if you're inhaling or exhaling. Okay, what are the steps in the formation of an action potential? First, the cell receives a stimulus in the dendrites, okay, in the preganglionic or presynaptic cell. Now, if this graded stimulus is big enough, this creates a voltage-gated sodium channel to open. The sodium rushes in to the axon, and that creates the action potential. So if the graded potential is big enough and it can take the voltage from -70, which is our resting potential, to this threshold of all or nothing to negative 55, this will cause the action potential. Okay? There is no going back. Once it hits this negative 55 mark, the muscle will contract. Okay? What is a transmembrane potential? That is just basically the charge across the cell membrane. Okay? A cell at rest, usually it's negative on the inside, positive on the outside. Now with the action potential, if it's big enough, this causes the transmembrane potential to go from negative 70 to negative 55. And then this literally changes up the charge or the transmembrane potential of the cell. What is a graded potential? This is the stimulus received by the soma or the body of the neuron, okay? So whenever you hear graded potential, don't think of the axon, think of the body, okay? The body receives the signal. If it is big enough, it will carry it to the axon hillock. I should have a picture of a nerve on the next slide. And then this axon hillock, once the graded potential is big enough, it causes the transmembrane potential to change, sodium channels open up, and then the action potential is elicited. Okay, the action potential has to do with the axon itself. What is resting membrane potential? So that is the voltage at rest. We said it was negative 70 millivolts. The threshold potential, we already discussed this, is negative 55. Okay, once the graded potential reaches negative 55, the action potential occurs. What is spatial summation? What is temporal summation? And what is the all or nothing principle? So spatial summation is stimulus from different synapses join to form a postsynaptic response that is additive. So you have one neuron here. Okay, you have stimuluses coming from different neurons, and that elicits a response down the line of the axon. That's it. Okay, multiple neurons acting on one neuron to elicit a response. Temporal summation is just regularly spaced intervals at one synapse. So these signals are just coming in one at a time, boom, in order. Just one at a time. Okay, it's a spaced out temporal summation. Now the spatial summation, again, remember, is coming from different neurons. Temporal summation is just a singular response. Very steady. Now the all or nothing principle, we already talked about a little bit. We said that once the threshold goes from negative 70 and it reaches negative 55, that's it. The axon, the neuron is gonna fire. It will go and you will contract the muscle. Okay, so let's say the graded potential is not strong enough and our membrane potential goes to negative 60. Is that enough to elicit an action potential? Exactly. No, it's not. It needs to be negative 55 or above. All right. What is a sodium potassium pump? So it requires ATP to move sodium and potassium out of a cell or inside of a cell. It moves it's down here actually. So what is the purpose of the sodium potassium pump? It is to restore membrane potential after hyperpolarization. So let me try to make a quick little graph here for you about the action potential. We have depolarization happening, sodium channels open, sodium channels close right here, potassium channels open, repolarization. Now these potassium channels, they're kind of slow to close. They don't close that fast. What does that do? This causes the membrane potential to dip below our -70, which is normal. So what happens here? Now there's too many potassium inside and there's too many sodium inside as well. So just to make this go back to normal, back to 70, we have our sodium potassium pump here. This is where it's working in this hyperpolarization state. So it pumps for every 3 sodium it puts out, 3 out, 2 potassium come in. Okay, next, the opening of the sodium channels in the membrane cause what? So remember, sodium channels are right here, this portion, let me write it. So this part is depolarization, and this is sodium channels. Okay, this part is repolarization, and this has to do with the potassium or K plus channels. Okay, so the sodium channels are right here, and then the potassium channels act right here in this part, the repolarization phase of the action potential. All right, next question is, what is a leaky membrane? Channel characterized by, so it's just the passive movement of ions, okay? Common leaky membranes are potassium, and that's basically it for the sake of this lesson. What is voltage membrane channel characterized by? All of these are pretty much in their name. Voltage opens up ion channels in response to a voltage or action potential, right? And then a chemical membrane is characterized by either a neurotransmitter or a hormone to open up the channel. So whether it's acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, these neurotransmitters or hormones are used to open up this channel. They bind onto it, the channel opens up. Okay, what is a mechanical membrane channel characterized by? It is characterized by a mechanical movement to open up the channel. Okay, what are the ions that participate in an action potential? Sodium and potassium, right? Again, sodium rushes into the cell, it depolarizes, it closes, potassium opens up, potassium leaves the cell, I'm sorry, it enters the cell, then it goes down. And that's basically it. These two ions control the action potential. All right, now we're talking about the synaptic knob. So at the end of the axon terminal, we have these things called synaptic knobs, okay? Well, the function inside of them, they have these vesicles that carry the neurotransmitters or the hormones, okay? The ones that we talked about a lot in the last review was the acetylcholine neurotransmitter being exocytosed into the synaptic cleft on the motor end plate just to cause the muscle to contract. I don't know if you guys remember that. but that was happening in the synaptic knob. Now we're getting into more details. So what happens in the synaptic knob? Well, the action potential reaches it, of course. Remember, there were calcium-gated channels that are activated that allow calcium into the synaptic knob for the release of these vesicles. Okay, these vesicles will not be released if calcium does not come in. Okay, here is a neuron. We have the cell body, the nucleus, the Nissl bodies, that is what your professor was talking about. Okay, and these help produce some of the neurotransmitters and hormones that are carried down the axon terminal into these vesicles. Okay, these are one of the areas that the acetylcholine or other neurotransmitters are produced. Next, we have the axon itself, this long thing. We have it myelinated, which is good, very fast response. And this is the axon hillock I was talking about, this little convergence here. So this is basically where the soma becomes the axon. Okay. And then so I wanted to show you guys the saltatory conduction real quick. We said that saltatory conduction was with myelinated axons. So these signals literally just jump from node to node. This is saltatory conduction right here. Now, if these myelin sheaths were not there, then it would just go down the straight line right here. And this is much slower. All right, almost done here, guys. What are the most common types of synapses in the nervous system? Okay, we have cholinergic, adrenergic, and nicotinic. The two types of synapses and their corresponding neurotransmitters, I just gave you all three. So cholinergic uses acetylcholine. Adrenergic, think of adrenaline, but it uses norepinephrine, not epinephrine, okay? And then nicotinic also uses acetylcholine, but it also responds to the drug nicotine. Where is that? All right. So where are neurotransmitters produced? Within the neuron. So we said Nissl bodies was one of them. Okay. So they also produced in the soma and the Nissl bodies, and also the rough endoplasmic reticulum. What is the main function of dopamine? It is the stress hormone, the feel-good hormone. Okay. Next, another one is serotonin. What is its main function? Regulates mood, and this is either inhibitory or excitatory. So it can either excite an neuron, or it either inhibits the neuron. And the main function of acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter between synapses, and its main function is to excite the neuron. Okay, so what is a reflex? Define reflex and define tone. So what is a stretch reflex? So it is a reflex where muscle spindles are the receptors, and they just monitor the length of muscles. So the receptors that respond to this stretch are called muscle spindles. Okay, they're very long and very thin. Define reflex, it is an automatic response to a stimulus. And then tone is just the normal level of firmness or slight contraction in a resting muscle. Okay, so the more you work out, the more you're active, the more toned your muscles are. Why? Because you're using them, they're being used, they're being built. If you're just sitting around, these muscles are being wasted away, and they're not as tight, they're not as firm. Okay? Define mobility. So mobility is the ability to move your joints. That's it. What is positive feedback? It is a response that further drives the reaction in its intended direction. Okay, so for example, blood clotting is a positive feedback loop. Okay, more blood recruits more platelets. The more platelets there are, that causes more platelets to come, even more platelets to come, and then the more platelets cause even more platelets to come. So it's moving it in the intended direction. It wants to clot the blood to stop you from bleeding out. What are effectors? We talked about this a lot in the beginning. Okay, so muscles or glands that make the necessary motor changes to the sensory response your body receives. So again, a fly lands on your hand, you do not want it there. The sensory signal gets sent up your brain tells your arm to move. So your hand muscle is the effector. It causes the change. Okay? All right. So what is an upper motor lesion? What is a lower motor lesion? And what is an epidural block? An upper motor lesion is damage to the motor neurons in the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so upper motor neurons are all neurons in your brain and spinal cord. Lower motor neurons are neurons that extend from the spinal cord to the rest of the body. Okay. And what is an epidural block? Again, it just blocks the sensory information from below the puncture point. What is a subdural block? It blocks the space below the dura mater and blocks motor movements. So the epidural is just sensory information that's blocked. Okay. The subdural is motor movements are blocked. Okay, not just your senses. And this is below the dura mater. This is why it's called the subdural space below the dura. I'm sorry, subdural block. What is a spinal tap? It is a procedure to receive cerebrospinal fluid. What is meningitis? Remember, the meninges is the connective tissue surrounding the brain and spinal cord. They offer protection. So it's just basically either it can be a virus or a bacteria that causes this infection. Okay. And there's just an inflammation of that tissue. Lastly, what is poliomyelitis? It's just a polio virus that causes abnormal motor function. And then Wallerian degeneration. Okay, please know Wallerian degeneration. The distal axons are damaged after an injury. So what does that mean? This is your axon. This is that's the soma. These are the dendrites. And this is your axon right here. Let's say you get damaged. Oh, come on. Sorry. Okay, I'll make this quicker. Let's say this is damaged right here. It's cut right here. Wallerian degeneration states that the axon distal from the injury or farther away from the cell body starts degrading. This is no longer here. Okay, but over time, it will eventually restore itself and be a brand new neuron. All right, guys, that's it. I basically went over everything. Let me